Welcome to the Restricted Handling Daily Intel Brief. This is what's been going on in Iran and the Middle East in the past 24 hours. Iran is pushing hard to turn post-war momentum into something structural. Not temporary leverage, not crisis management, but an actual system where its role in governing maritime access is recognized and locked in. The idea coming out of Tehran is fairly consistent across different officials. Gulf security should be handled by regional actors. External military presence, especially U.S. forces, should fade out over time, and the Strait of Hormuz should be governed through arrangements that give Iran a formal say over transit conditions. That last piece is where everything tightens, because the discussion around Hormuz is no longer just about open navigation versus disruption. It's shifting toward control mechanisms. There are proposals and counter-proposals floating through Oman and other intermediaries that would effectively introduce a structured system for transit. Think service fees, maritime administration, and coordinated routing. On the surface, this is being described as safety and navigation management. Underneath that, it's about authority. Who decides, who enforces, and who benefits? Iran's position is increasingly clear. It wants that authority recognized as part of the post-conflict settlement, not informally exercised, but acknowledged. And it is linking that issue to everything else. Nuclear talks, sanctions relief, and broader diplomatic engagement are all being implicitly tied back to whether Tehran gets what it considers baseline recognition over the strait. Oman sits right in the middle of this, and its role is expanding in ways that are hard to overstate. Muscat is not just mediating conversations anymore. It is actively shaping the architecture of possible agreements. Omani officials have floated concepts that resemble maritime service frameworks, where shipping companies contribute to maintaining safe passage. The problem is that there is no shared definition of what those contributions mean. Voluntary support in one interpretation becomes mandatory tolling in another. And that ambiguity is exactly what makes the issue so politically sensitive. If even partially implemented, this would mark a major shift in how one of the world's most important energy choke points is governed. Historically, Hormuz has functioned as a largely open corridor under international norms. What is being discussed now edges toward managed access, with regional powers exerting layered control. And that brings us back to the United States' position, which is pushing firmly against any system that resembles tolling or exclusive control. Washington is treating freedom of navigation as non-negotiable, while also trying to avoid a renewed escalation cycle that could destabilize energy markets again. The diplomatic track in Doha is still active, but it is operating on a very thin channel. U.S. envoys are engaging with Qatari officials, who are acting as intermediaries with Tehran. Iran, for its part, is not engaging directly with U.S. representatives. Instead, it is treating these meetings as technical consultations tied to implementation of earlier understandings. The core mismatch is sequencing. Iran wants financial and procedural deliverables first, especially access to frozen assets and sanctions relief mechanisms. Only after that does it consider deeper strategic discussions, including nuclear constraints. The U.S. approach is the reverse. Broader security guarantees and nuclear limitations first, then economic steps. That disagreement keeps the process from moving into anything resembling final negotiation. What exists right now is more maintenance than progress. Inside that diplomatic gap, both sides are still signaling confidence in their own position. U.S. messaging has leaned heavily into the idea that Washington retains leverage regardless of how talks end. The argument being made is that Iran's military capabilities have been significantly degraded, and that strategic pressure remains on Tehran whether diplomacy succeeds or fails. At the same time, there is still active contingency planning around military options, even if those are not the preferred path at the moment. The key tension inside Washington is not whether force is possible, but whether using it would collapse the diplomatic structure that is currently holding, however loosely. Energy markets are reacting to all of this in a very specific way. Prices are not behaving like they did during earlier spikes in the conflict. Crude is relatively stable, sitting in the low $70 range, but that stability is deceptive. The underlying system is still stressed. Refined fuel markets are where pressure is most visible. Diesel and gasoline remain tight, reflecting refinery constraints and lingering disruption in supply chains tied to the Gulf. Shipping flows through Hormuz have partially resumed, but not at a level that would be described as fully normalized. Instead, what you see is uneven movement. Some days heavier traffic, other days hesitation, rerouting, or reduced transparency from vessels operating in the region. That matters because it keeps a risk premium embedded in the system even when headline prices look calm. Traders are effectively pricing a situation where disruption is not constant, but still very possible. There are also ongoing reports of maritime incidents, reinforcing that uncertainty. Some vessels attempting transit outside of preferred routes have faced engagement or interference, and shipping companies continue to behave cautiously. Even where passage is technically open, operational confidence is not fully restored. That shows up in insurance costs, routing decisions, and delayed normalization of trade flows. In Lebanon, the situation is evolving along a parallel track that connects back into the broader Iran-Israel dynamic. A U.S.-backed framework is attempting to create phased security arrangements in the south of the country. The idea is to gradually shift control to Lebanese armed forces while reducing armed non-state infrastructure, particularly tied to Hezbollah, and allowing Israeli repositioning from selected zones. On paper, it looks like a structured de-escalation plan. On the ground, it is far more complicated. Israel continues targeted operations against suspected Hezbollah positions while maintaining forward defensive depth in the form of buffer zones. Hezbollah, meanwhile, retains significant missile capacity and continues intermittent engagement. The United States is now preparing to place monitoring personnel on the ground through CENTCOM to observe compliance and verify incidents. That is a subtle but important change. It is less about direct operational involvement and more about controlling the information environment around violations. In this kind of conflict space, reporting speed and verification often shape diplomatic response as much as the incidents themselves. Inside Iran, there is another layer of pressure building at the edges. Kurdish regions in the northwest have seen a rise in attacks on security personnel, with multiple groups either claiming responsibility or being attributed involvement by Iranian authorities. These are localized events, but they add internal strain at a moment when Iran is simultaneously managing external negotiations, maritime leverage, and internal political alignment over strategy. Finally, there is the humanitarian pressure point that sits underneath all of this. The UN agency responsible for Palestinian refugees is facing a serious funding shortfall, with leadership warning that operations are approaching a breaking point without additional financial support. Service reductions are already underway, staffing is constrained, and capacity across multiple regions has been reduced. That matters because it does not remain isolated as a humanitarian issue. It feeds directly into political stability in Gaza, Lebanon, and surrounding areas. When aid systems weaken, pressure shifts into governments, armed groups, and already fragile social structures. So when you put everything together, the system looks less like separate crises and more like a single interconnected pressure field. Hormuz is the strategic anchor. Oman is the mediator shaping its possible future. Doha is the negotiation channel trying to hold a fragile diplomatic thread together. Lebanon is the active security front. Iran's internal environment adds structural tension, and energy markets are sitting underneath all of it, absorbing uncertainty without fully pricing resolution. Thanks for listening. If you value clear, consistent analysis, leaving a review or a comment helps others discover the show. We also publish a daily intel brief on Substack, restrictedhandling.substack.com, offering deeper coverage on Russia, China, Iran, the Middle East, and the DPRK. Appreciate your time. Have a great day.